Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here, and today we're going to go back into H.G. Wells' The Outline of History to see if we can find some interesting material and see how someone from almost exactly 100 years ago could view history. So, in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, perhaps the most famous passage, or at least one of the top 5 or so, is the so-called Archaeology, which is Thucydides' attempt to reconstruct the early history of Greece before the present era of recorded history. How did the Greeks become so civilized? How did these great cities emerge? How did fleets come to be? Thucydides showed a lot of imagination in that passage. In H.G. Wells's chapter 10 on the early thought of man, which, by the way, is preceded by a whole lot of stuff about the formation of the earth and the evolution of man, so basically old school science. He then goes into trying to figure out how the mind of a Paleolithic or Neolithic man worked. And we see that he very much was a product of his time, and an impressively informed one at that. He basically lays out a case for cave drawings being some form of sympathetic magic, which is an idea that anthropologists and sociologists held for a very long time, and which still has some degree of currency even today. H.G. Wells also talks a lot about the development of the imagination and its links to language. That is something that is an idea which has really been pervasive for a long period of time. A lot of people who are linguistic experts claim that an idea cannot exist unless there's a word for it, especially the kind of people who write lengthy books in the classics field seem to think that way. So even though a lot of what H.G. Wells says, such as calling undeveloped cultures primitive or savage or barbaric, all those things are kind of, you wouldn't see that today certainly. But if you get beyond that, then you see that this is actually a fairly imaginative look at the ancient mind. And while there are certainly a lot of things that he says that I would not give much credence to, I can't decisively refute anything that he has to say here, simply because the state of our knowledge on this field has advanced far less than our state of knowledge about just about everything else that H.G. Wells talks about in his book. So in many ways, I think that this is the best display of H.G. Wells's considerable intellect. And also, he displays quite a bit of prowess when it comes to the written word in this particular chapter. So I hope you enjoy Chapter 10 of H.G. Wells's The Outline of History. Chapter 10, Early Thought. Before we go on to tell how 6,000 or 7,000 years ago men began to gather into the first towns and to develop something more than the loose-knit tribes that had hitherto been their highest political association, something must be said about the things that were going on inside these brains of which we have traced the growth and development through a period of 500,000 years from the ape-man stage. What was man thinking about himself and about the world in those remote days? At first he thought very little about anything but immediate things. At first he was busy thinking such things as, "Here is a bear, what shall I do?" or "There is a squirrel, how can I get it?" Until language had developed to some extent, there could have been little thinking beyond the range of actual experience, for language is the instrument of thought as bookkeeping is the instrument of business. It records and fixes and enables thought to get to more and more complex ideas. It is the hand of the mind to hold and keep. Primordial man, before he could talk, probably saw very vividly, mimicked very cleverly, gestured, laughed, danced, and lived without much speculation about whence he came or why he lived. He feared the dark, no doubt, and thunderstorms, and big animals, and queer things, and whatever he dreamt about, and no doubt he did things to propitiate what he feared or to change his luck and please the imaginary powers in rock and beast and river. He made no clear distinction between animate and inanimate things. If a stick hurt him, he kicked it. If the river foamed and flooded, he thought it was hostile. His thought was probably very much at the level of a bright little contemporary boy of 4 or 5. He had the same subtle unreasonableness of transition and the same limitations. But since he had little or no speech, he would do little to pass on the fancies that came to him and develop any tradition or concerted acts about them. The drawings even of late Paleolithic man do not suggest that he paid any attention to sun or moon or stars or trees. He was preoccupied only with animals and men. Probably he took day and night, sun and stars, trees and mountains, as being in the nature of things, as a child takes its meal times and its nursery staircase for granted. So far as we can judge, he drew no fantasies, no ghost, or anything of that sort. The reindeer man's drawings are fearless, familiar things, with no hint about them of any veneration. He may have felt that drawing a beast made it come. His drawings may have been magic drawings for luck and hunting, but they do not look like drawings for worship. There is scarcely anything that we can suppose to be a religious or mythical symbol at all in his productions. No doubt he had a certain amount of what is called fetishism in his life. He did things we should now think unreasonable to produce desired ends, for that is all fetishism amounts to. It is only incorrect science based on guesswork or false analogy, and entirely different in its nature from religion. No doubt he was excited by his dreams, and his dreams mixed up at times in his mind with his waking impressions and puzzled him. Since he buried his dead, and since even the later Neanderthal men seem to have buried their dead, and apparently with food and weapons, it has been argued that he had a belief in a future life. But it is just as reasonable to suppose that early men buried their dead with food and weapons because they doubted if they were dead, which is not the same thing as believing them to have immortal spirits, and that their belief in their continuing vitality was reinforced by dreams of the departed. They may have ascribed a sort of werewolf existence to the dead and wished to propitiate them. The reindeer man, we feel, was too intelligent and too like ourselves not to have had some speech, but quite probably it was not very serviceable for anything beyond direct statement or matter-of-fact narration. He lived in a larger community than the Neanderthaler or his own Neanderthaloid ancestor or any great ape, but how large the tribe we do not know. Except when game is swarming, hunting communities must not keep together in large bodies, or they will starve. The Indians who depend upon the caribou and Labrador must be living under circumstances rather like those of the reindeer men. They scatter in small family groups, as the caribou scatter in search of food, but when the deer collect for the seasonal migration, the Indians also collect. That is the time for trade and feast and marriage. The simplest American Indian is 10,000 years more sophisticated than the reindeer man, but probably that sort of gathering and dispersal was also the way of the reindeer man. At Solutra in France, there are traces of a great camping and feasting place. There was no doubt an exchange of news there, but one may doubt if there was anything like an exchange of ideas. One sees no scope in such a life for theology or philosophy or superstition or speculation. Fears, yes, but unsystemic fears. Fancies and freaks of the imagination, but personal and transitory freaks and fancies. Perhaps there was a certain power of suggestion in these encounters. A fear really felt needs few words for its transmission. A value set upon something may be very simply conveyed. In these questions of primitive thought and religion, we must remember that the lowly and savage peoples of today probably throw very little light on the mental state of men before the days of fully developed language. Primordial man could have had little or no tradition before the development of speech. All savage and primitive peoples of today, on the contrary, are soaked in tradition, the tradition of thousands of generations. They may have weapons like their remote ancestors and methods like them, but what were slight and shallow impressions on the minds of their predecessors are now deep and intricate grooves worn throughout the intervening centuries, generation by generation. Certain very fundamental things there may have been in men's minds long before the coming of speech. The mental life of the later Paleolithic man was close to our own, and like our own it was built on the foundations of that ancient, more solitary, more animal, ape-like ancestor. The rapidly developing science of psychoanalysis is searching through our dreams, and our inadvertent moods and our childish ideas, and what remains ascertainable of savage thought, for the foundation substance of that more primitive being who is our substratum. And it is rapidly building up an interpretation of our feelings upon that search. The great apes pair and rear their young. The young go in fear of the old male, and presently the young males rouse his jealousy and are killed or driven off. The females are the protected slaves of the old male. That is the general state of affairs with all slightly gregarious animals, and there is no reason to suppose that the sub-man differed in such respects. The fear of the old man was the beginning of social wisdom. The young of the primitive squatting place grew up under that fear. Objects associated with him were probably forbidden. Everyone was forbidden to touch his spear or to sit in his place, just as today little boys must not touch father's pipe or sit in his chair. He was probably the master of all the women. The youths of the little community had to remember that. Their mothers taught them to remember that. Their mothers instilled into them dread and respect and consideration for the old man. The idea of something forbidden, the idea of things being, as it is called, taboo, not to be touched, not to be looked at, may thus have got well into the subhuman mind at a very early stage indeed. J.J. Atkinson, in his Primal Law, an ingenious analysis of these primitive taboos which are found among savage peoples all over the world, the taboos that separate brother and sister, the taboos that make a man run and hide from his stepmother, traces them to such a fundamental cause as this. Only by respecting this primal law could the young male hope to escape the old man's wrath. A disposition to propitiate the old man even after he was dead is also quite understandable. He must have been an actor in many primordial nightmares. One was not sure that he was dead. He might only be asleep, or shamming. Long after an old man was dead, when there was nothing to represent him but a mound and a megalith, the women would continue to convey to their children how awful and wonderful he was. And being still a terror to his own little tribe, it was easy to go on hoping that he would be a terror to other and hostile people. In his life he had fought for his tribe, even if he had bullied it. Why not when he was dead? One sees that the old man idea was an idea very natural to the primitive mind and capable of great developments. The fear of the father passed by imperceptible degrees into the fear of the tribal god. And opposed to the old man, more human and kindlier, was the mother, who helped and sheltered and advised. It was she who trained her children to obey and fear him. She whispered in the corner and taught mysteries. The psychoanalysis of Freud and Jung has done much to help us realize how great a part father fear and mother love still play in the adaptation of the human mind to social needs. Their exhaustive study of childish and youthful dreams and imaginations has done much to help in the reconstruction of the soul of primitive man. It was, as it were, the soul of a powerful child. He saw the universe in terms of the family lord. His fear of, his abjection before, the old man mingled with his fear of the dangerous animals about him. Even in modern nurseries, Dada will sometimes become a bear. It was easy for the sublimated old man, the initial god, to put on an animal form. The woman goddesses were kindlier and more subtle. They helped, they protected, they gratified, and consoled. Yet, at the same time, there was something about them less comprehensible than the direct brutality of the old man, a greater mystery. So that the woman also had her vesture of fear for primitive man. Goddesses were feared. They had to do with secret things. Another very fundamental idea probably arose in men's minds early out of the mysterious visitation of infectious diseases, and that was the idea of uncleanness and of being accursed. From that, too, there may have come an idea of avoiding particular places and persons in particular phases of health. Here was the root of another set of taboos. Then man, from the very dawn of his mental life, may have had a feeling of the sinister about places and things. Animals who dread traps have that feeling. A tiger will abandon its usual jungle route at the sight of a few threads of cotton. Like most young animals, young human beings are easily made fearful of this or that by their nurses and seniors. Here is another set of ideas of repulsion and avoidance, that sprang up almost inevitably in men. As soon as speech began to develop, it must have got to work upon such fundamental feelings and begun to systematize them, and keep them in mind. By talking together, men would reinforce each other's fears and establish a common tradition of taboos of things forbidden and of things unclean. With the idea of uncleanness would come ideas of cleansing and of removing a curse. The cleansing would be conducted through the advice and with the aid of wise old men or wise old women, and in such cleansing would lie the germ of the earliest priestcraft and witchcraft. To lift curses, to remove evils, to confirm and establish, one must needs do potent things. And was there anything more potent in existence than killing, the shedding of life blood? Speech from the first would be a powerful supplement to the merely imitative education and to the education of cuffs and blows conducted by a speechless parent. Mothers would tell their young and scold their young. As speech developed, men would find that they had experiences and persuasions that gave them, or seemed to give them, power. They would make secrets of these things. There is a double streak in the human mind, a streak of cunning secretiveness, and a streak, perhaps of later origin, that makes us all anxious to tell and astonish and impress each other. Many people make secrets in order to have secrets to tell. These secrets of early men they would convey to younger, more impressionable people, more or less honestly and impressively in some process of initiation. Moreover, the pedagogic spirit overflows in the human mind. Most people like telling other people not to. Extensive arbitrary prohibitions for the boys, for the girls, for the women, also probably came very early into human history and were congenial things to impose. Sacrifice had a double origin. There must have been the disposition to propitiate the old man, and also that craving to do a powerful thing. Sacrifice has perhaps always been rather magic than propitiation. It dispelled, it confirmed, and because it did so then, when one came to think about it, one concluded that it must be pleasing to the spirit of the old man, grown into the tribal god. But it was done because it was done, and because it was a tremendous thing to do. Out of such ideas and a jumble of kindred ones grew the first quasi-religious elements in human life. With every development of speech, it became possible to intensify and develop the tradition of taboos and restraints and ceremonies. There is not a savage or barbaric race today that is not held in a net of such tradition. With the coming of primitive pasturage, there would be a considerable broadening out of this sort of practice. Things hitherto unheeded would be found of importance in human affairs. Neolithic man was nomadic in a different spirit from the mere daylight drift after food of the primordial hunter. He was a herdsman, upon whose mind a sense of direction and the lie of the land had been forced. He watched his flock by night as well as by day. The sun by day and presently the stars by night helped to guide his migrations. He began to find after many ages that the stars are steadier guides than the sun. He would begin to note particular stars and star groups, and to distinguish any individual thing was, for primitive man, to believe it individualized and personal. He would begin to think of outstanding stars as persons, very shining and dignified and trustworthy persons looking at him like bright eyes in the night. They came back night after night. They helped him even as the tribal gods helped him. His primitive tillage strengthened his sense of the seasons. Particular stars ruled his heavens when seed time was due. Up to a certain point, a mountain peak or what not, a bright star moved, night after night. It stopped there, and then night by night it receded. Surely this was a sign, a silent, marvelous warning to the wise. The beginnings of agriculture, we must remember, were in the subtropical zone, or even nearer the equator, where stars of the first magnitude shine with a splendor unknown in more temperate latitudes. The seasons there are not so plainly marked by snow and storm as in the north. It was difficult to be sure when the rains or the floods were due, but the stars did not lie. And Neolithic man was counting, and falling under the spell of numbers. There are savage languages that have no number for any number above 5. Some peoples cannot go above 2, but Neolithic man in the lands of his origin in Asia and Africa, even more than in Europe, was already counting his accumulating possessions. He was beginning to use tallies, and wondering at the triangularity of 3 and the squareness of 4, and why some quantities like 12 were easy to divide in all sorts of ways, and others like 13 impossible. 12 became a noble, generous, and familiar number to him, and 13 rather an outcast and disreputable one. Probably man began reckoning time by the clock of the full and new moons. Moonlight is an important thing to herdsmen who no longer merely hunt their herds, but watch and guard them. Moonlight, too, was, perhaps, his time for love-making, as indeed it may have been for primordial man and the ground ape ancestor before him. But from the phases of the moon, as his tillage increased, man's attitude would go on to the greater cycle of the seasons. Primordial man probably only drifted before the winter as the days grew cold. Neolithic man knew surely that the winter would come, and stored his fodder and presently his grain. He had to fix a seed time, a propitious seed time, or his sowing was a failure. The earliest recorded reckoning is by moons and by generations of men. With agriculture began the difficult task of squaring the lunar month with the solar year, a task which has left its scars on our calendar today. Easter shifts uneasily from year to year, to the great discomfort of holidaymakers. It is now inconveniently early and now late in the season, because of this ancient reference of time to the moon. And when men began to move with set intention from place to place with their animal and other possessions, then they would begin to develop the idea of other places in which they were not, and to think of what might be in those other places. And in any valley where they lingered for a time, they would, remembering how they got there, ask, how did this or how did that thing get here? They would begin to wonder what was beyond the mountains, and where the sun went when it set, and what was above the clouds. The capacity for telling things increased with their vocabulary. The simple individual fancies, the unsystematic fetish tricks, and fundamental taboos of Paleolithic man began to be handed on and made into a more consistent system. Men began to tell stories about themselves, about the tribe, about its taboos, and why they had to be, about the world, and the why for the world. A tribal mind came into existence, a tradition. Paleolithic man was certainly more of a free individualist, more of an artist as well as more of a savage than Neolithic man. Neolithic man was coming under prescription. He could be trained from his youth and told to do things and not to do things. He was not so free to form independent ideas of his own about things. He had thoughts given to him. He was under a new power of suggestion. To have more words and to attend more to words is not simply to increase mental power. Words themselves are powerful things and dangerous things. Paleolithic man's words, perhaps, were chiefly just names. He used them for what they were. But Neolithic man was thinking about these words. He was thinking about a number of things with a great deal of verbal confusion, and getting to some odd conclusions. In speech he had woven a net to bind his race together, but also a net to bind his feet. Man was binding himself into newer and larger and more efficient combinations indeed, but at a price. One of the most notable things about the Neolithic age is the total absence of that free, direct artistic impulse which was the supreme quality of later Paleolithic man. We find much industry, much skill, polished implements, pottery with conventional designs, cooperation upon all sorts of things, but no evidence of personal creativeness. Self-suppression is beginning for men. Man has entered upon the long and tortuous and difficult path towards a life for the common good, with all its sacrifice of personal impulse, which he is still treading today. Certain things appear in the mythology of mankind again and again. Neolithic man was enormously impressed by serpents, and he no longer took the sun for granted. Nearly everywhere that Neolithic culture went, there went a disposition to associate the sun and the serpent in decoration and worship, This primitive serpent worship spread ultimately far beyond the regions where the snake is of serious practical importance in human life. But when at last the center of diffusion of the Neolithic way of living is determined, it will surely be a land in which snake and sunlight were the facts of primary importance. With the beginnings of agriculture, a fresh set of ideas arose in men's minds. We have noted a long-established connection in the human mind between sowing and sacrifice. Sowing was becoming the most important of economic acts. It was natural to associate with it the most vivid of conceivable acts, the killing of a man. Sir J. G. Fraser has pursued the development of this association, linking up with it the conception of special sacrificial persons who were killed at seed time, the conception of a specially purified class of people to kill these victims, the class of priests, and the conception of a sacrament, a ceremonial feast, in which the tribe eat portions of the body of the victim in order to share in and identify themselves as closely as possible with the sacrificial benefits. From this beginning grew the great seasonal sacrificial religions that still remain with us. Out of all these factors, out of the old man tradition, out of the emotions that surround women for men and men for women, out of the desire to escape infection and uncleanness, out of the desire for power and success through magic, out of the sacrificial tradition of seed time, and out of a number of like beliefs and mental experiments and misconceptions, a complex something was growing up in the lives of men, which was beginning to bind them together mentally and emotionally in a common life and action. This something we may call religion, from the Latin religare, to bind. It was not a simple or logical something, it was a tangle of ideas about commanding beings and spirits, about gods, about all sorts of must and must-nots. Like all other human interest, religion has grown. It must be clear from what has gone before that primitive man, much less his ancestral apes and his ancestral Mesozoic mammals, could have no idea of God or religion. Only very slowly did his brain and his powers of comprehension become capable of such general conceptions. Religion is something that has grown up with and through human association. God has been and is still being discovered by man. This book is not a theological book, and it is not for us to embark upon theological discussion. But it is a necessary and central part of the history of man to describe the dawn and development of his religious ideas and their influence upon his activities. All these factors we have noted must have contributed to this development, and various writers have laid down most stress upon one or the other of them. Sir J. G. Fraser has been the leading student of the derivation of sacraments from magic sacrifices. Grant Allen, following Herbert Spencer in his evolution of the idea of God, laid stress chiefly on the posthumous worship of the old man. Sir E. B. Tyler, Primitive Culture, gave his attention mainly to the disposition of primitive man to ascribe a soul to every object, animate and inanimate. Mr. A. E. Crowley, in The Tree of Life, has called attention to other centers of impulse and emotion, and particularly to sex as a source of deep excitement. The thing we have to bear in mind is that Neolithic man was still mentally undeveloped. He could be confused, and illogical to a degree quite impossible to an educated modern person. Conflicting and contradictory ideas could lie in his mind without challenging one another. Now one thing ruled his thoughts intensely and vividly, and now another. His fears, his acts, were still disconnected as children's are. Confusedly, under the stimulus of the need and possibility of cooperation in a combined life, Neolithic mankind was feeling out for guidance and knowledge. Men were becoming aware that personally they needed protection and direction, cleansing from impurity, power beyond their own strength. Confusedly, in response to that demand, bold men, wise men, shrewd and cunning men were arising to become magicians, priests, chiefs, and kings. They are not to be thought of as cheats or usurpers of power, nor the rest of mankind as their dupes. All men are mixed in their motives. 100 things move men to seek ascendancy over other men, but not all such motives are base or bad. The magicians usually believed in their own magic, the priests in their ceremonies, the chiefs in their right. The history of mankind henceforth is a history of more or less blind endeavors to conceive a common purpose in relation to which all men may live happily, and to create and develop a common consciousness and a common stock of knowledge which may serve and illuminate that purpose. In a vast variety of forms, this appearance of kings and priests and magic men was happening all over the world under later Paleolithic and Neolithic conditions. Everywhere mankind was seeking where knowledge and mastery and magic power might reside. Everywhere individual men were willing, honestly or dishonestly, to rule, to direct, or to be the magic beings who would reconcile the confusions of the community. A queer development of the later Paleolithic and Neolithic ages was self-mutilation. Men began to cut themselves about, to excise noses, ears, fingers, teeth, and the like, and to attach all sorts of superstitious ideas to these acts. Many children today pass through a similar phase in their mental development. There is a phase in the life of most little girls when they are not to be left alone with a pair of scissors for fear that they will cut off their hair. No animal does anything of this sort. This too has left its trace in the rite of circumcision upon the religions of Judaism and Islam. In many ways, the simplicity, directness, and detachment of a later Paleolithic rock painter appeal more to modern adult sympathies than does the state of mind of these Neolithic men, full of the fear of some ancient old man who had developed into a tribal god, obsessed by ideas of sacrificial propitiations, mutilations, and magic murder. No doubt the reindeer hunter was a ruthless killer and a combative and passionate creature, but he killed for reasons we can still understand. Neolithic man, under the sway of talk and a confused thought process, killed on theory. He killed for monstrous and now incredible ideas. He killed those he loved through fear and under direction. Those Neolithic men not only made human sacrifices at seed time, there's every reason to suppose they sacrificed wives and slaves at the burial of their chieftains. They killed men, women, and children whenever they were under adversity and thought the gods were athirst. All these things were passed on into the Bronze Age, yet hereto a social consciousness had been asleep, and not even dreaming in human history. Before it awakened, it produced nightmares. Away beyond the dawn of history, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, one thinks of the Wiltshire uplands and the twilight of a midsummer day's morning, the torches pale in the growing light. One has a dim apprehension of a procession through the avenue of stone, of priests, perhaps fantastically dressed with skins and horns and horrible painted masks. Not the robed and bearded dignitaries our artists represent the Druids to have been, of chiefs and skins adorned with necklaces of teeth and bearing spears and axes, their great heads of hair held up with pins of bone, of women in skins or flaxen robes, of a great peering crowd of shock-headed men and naked children. They have assembled from many distant places. The ground between the avenues and Silbury Hill is dotted with their encampments. A certain festive cheerfulness prevails, and amidst the throng march the appointed human victims, submissive, helpless, staring towards the distant smoking altar at which they are to die, that the harvest may be good and the tribe increase. To that had life progressed 3,000 or 4,000 years ago from its starting place in the slime of the tidal beaches.